Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're talking about topic 3.10, social movements and equal protection. And this, guys, I'm really excited about this lesson. Today we're talking about a brief history of three social movements: the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, and the LGBTQ rights movement. Again, this is a really brief overview. It's not meant to be the end-all, be-all history of each of these movements. We wouldn't have time for that in the entire time in our course. But we will talk about these more in class the next time we meet. Civil rights are, again, protections from discrimination based on characteristics such as race, national origin, religion, and sex. These rights are guaranteed to all citizens under the Due Process and Equal Protection Clauses of the U.S. Constitution, as well as acts of Congress. Social movements and the leadership and events associated with these social movements are evidence of how the Equal Protection Clause can support and activate people. Without the Equal Protection Clause, social movements wouldn't be able to go anywhere because states would not have to protect citizens equally. The civil rights movement is often thought of in terms of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, and for good reason. They are two men who did a lot to help to get the movement forward. But there is so much more than just these two men. From Juneteenth in 1865, when the last slaves were finally freed, to the Black Lives Matter protests of today, there has been a constant struggle for racial equality in our country. There have been steps forward, like the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts and the 24th Amendment, which banned poll taxes. But there have been steps backwards as well, such as the Tulsa race riots and the racialization of policing and imprisonment in our country. In class, we will be reading Martin Luther King Jr.'s A Letter from Birmingham Jail. As you prepare for that, I want you to think about what people of color are saying and asking for in the recent Black Lives Matter protests versus what Martin Luther King Jr. is saying and asking for. You are going to be asked to compare the two. So if you need to do some research into the Black Lives Matter protests, then please go ahead and do that now. Let's move on to the women's rights movement, which has been going on since before we were even a country. Prior to the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Abigail Adams wrote her husband this: "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." In that moment, prior to the writing of the Declaration of Independence, Abigail Adams voiced the call of women throughout the history of our country. It would take protests, the creation of the National Organization for Women, and countless arrests before women would earn the right to vote in 1920. And the fight for equal rights continues today. Since 1923, the Equal Rights Amendment has been introduced to Congress, and it would make women equal to men at a constitutional level. But almost 100 years later, the Equal Rights Amendment still has not been ratified. While many believe that the LGBTQ movement began in 1969 with the Stonewall riots in New York, the reality is that members of the LGBTQ community have been fighting for their rights for most of the history of the country. But in 1969, at a nightclub and hotel that catered to the LGBTQ community, called the Stonewall Hotel, it was targeted by police to be closed down. And most establishments that catered to this community at the time were targeted by police at some point or another. The patrons fought back, leading to protests that lasted for a month. Pride parades actually began the very next year to commemorate those protests, and they have continued every year since. In 1973, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, and it's the manual which doctors use to determine whether or not a patient has a mental disorder, took homosexuality out of the manual as a mental disorder for the first time. Prior to 1973, homosexuality was considered a mental disease. In our last lesson, we discussed Lawrence versus Texas and Oberfell versus Hodges, but in 2020, the court granted freedom from employment discrimination for LGBTQ people in the case of Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia. What this means is this: people can no longer be fired just for being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer. So, in this lesson, you should have learned a brief history of 3 social movements. Again, this was meant to be a brief overview and not meant to be an end-all be-all history. We will talk more about these in class, and I encourage you to do more research on your own. If there's anything you missed, please go back now and re-watch the portion of the video that you need to. Once you're done, go ahead and answer the summarizing question so that you can get a stamp the next time we're in class. All right, guys, we'll see you next time. Bye.